Welcome CSC 121, Fall 2020, to Exercise 7. This is RGB-Hex conversion. We'll just call it RGB-Hex. And before we get into it, I'm going to give you a quick lesson on hex numbers, hexadecimal number system. I'm going to try and do it with 10 comments here. Hopefully that'll be enough to learn about hexadecimal. And the first comment here says 8-bit numbers represent 0 through 255. You're probably familiar with that. Through RGB colors, we use 8-bit numbers to represent RGB numbers and RGB colors. So if there's a red, green, and a blue, we use an 8-bit number for each one. So we could have something like 25500 for red. We could have something like 02550 for green. We could have 128, 128, 128, and have them be all gray. They could be 000 for black, and so on. So we use those numbers for RGB. It's 24-bit because there's 3 8-bit channels. So you might be familiar with using that if you ever worked in a program that worked with color. And that's the way pixels are basically composed. Now, there's also something called hexadecimal number system. Now, they're not just used for colors, but they can be used for 8-bit numbers. And we are talking about 8-bit numbers, so we're only going to still be working with 0 through 255, except when they display the number, they only display 2 digits. They can't use 255. They have to use something else. Now, that's fine for smaller numbers. They're going to basically use a 16s place and a 1s place. So you basically say how many 16s there are and how many 1s there are in 2 digits. That's all you need to do. So it only uses 2 digits. And just for example, if you had the actual number 16 in decimal, the regular RGB number 16, there would be 116 and 0 1s. So in hex, it would be #10. We use the pound sign to indicate hex, even though we also use it for comments in Python. So that would be 10. It would be 116 and 0 1s. 116, 0 1s. That would be the hex number for that. So that was pretty easy. Now, if you have digits over 9, that creates a problem. So they actually use letters for 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 because you wouldn't need any numbers above 15 if you're sticking with 8-bit. So they only go up to 15 because the highest number you can make is 255. So again, the A is 10, the B is 11, the C is 12, the D is 13, E is 14, and F is 15. You just have to memorize that. So for example, the number 160 in RGB, the decimal number of 160, would basically be 160 divided by 16, which would be 10. Now you couldn't use 10, so you'd have to use A. So that would be A16s and 0 1s. So it would be A0 because there's 10 16s and 0 1s, which would be A16s. That's the way it works. And then finally, the highest number would be FF, which is 255, because that would mean there would be, if you took 255 and you divide it by 16, you would first get 15 divided in it singularly, which would be 15 16s, which would come up to 240, and then you would add 15 1s, which would make it 255, and that's how you would get your FF. So just for example, I'll just run this real quick. This is a finished sample here, which we'll be working on. And if I enter an RGB number of, let's just say 0, it would say 00 because we still want 2 digits, even though we're just putting 1 digit in there. So they still use 2 digits, even if there's just a 0. So we won't just put 0, we'll still put 00. So let's say a number is 16. We already used that one, so let's see if I was right. And it's 10 because there's 116 and 0 1s. And let's try 160 because I mentioned that up here in my comments. So that comes out to A0 because there's A 10 16s and 0 1s. And then finally, I'll do the highest one, 255, and it comes out to FF. So it's working. But what if somebody is a smart aleck and they decide they're going to put in a number higher than 255? Let's say they're going to put in 256. We have a little message that comes up and says use 0 through 255. So we're catching that. Now, we're not going to catch everything. We're not catching if someone types in a bunch of letters. There's nothing we could do right now because it's going to be converted to an integer since we're doing math. And if it's converted to an integer and someone's putting in letters, we're going to get an error unless we do some other kind of exception to try and catch it. But for now, we're just going to catch any number that is over the 255 in our if-else statements. And that's part of what we're doing here. We're using if-else statements so that if a number is 10, we're going to use A. And if a number is 11, we're going to use B, and so on. That's how we're going to convert these from being the regular numbers of 10 through 15 into letters, just like we did with the grades. So this is fairly simple of what we're doing here. So this will kind of finish off our if-else statements. So what we're going to do next is get started And I'm going to make a new file here. This is just a sample here, so I'm going to go back to my files. And I'm also going to check out my consoles and make sure that nothing's open. And I can see I have a couple open, including the one I was just practicing with, the sample. So I'll make sure they're all closed, and I'll go back to Files, and I'll go into CSC 121. I'll make a new file, and I'll just call it 7-RGB-Hex. We'll just call it that, and make sure you put the .py, 7-RGB-Hex.py. And this is going to be an if-else exercise. So I'll hit New File. Up here, we're just going to put an input, and we're going to make it real simple. We'll have a variable called RGB, and we'll set it to input, and we'll put a string in here, something like enter RGB number. Now, if you want to put, 0 through 255, you could. That'll help people from being smart Alex and putting in other numbers in there. So we can do that. And remember, if you put a colon and a space, it makes the prompt kind of come out a little bit, so it's a little easier to read, but make sure you finish off your quote and finish off your parentheses. And also this, now we could reassign it, or you could do it right here. Because we're doing math with it, we have to convert it to an int. So you can wrap int around it, or you could reassign it after the fact, but just make sure you have your parentheses that match up if you're doing an int, because we already know we're doing math, so we're going to do it right away. We don't have to wait to get an error to see what happens here. So that's going to be our RGB variable, and what we're going to do with that RGB variable is just do some division. We're going to do floor division and modulus. So that'll be fairly easy, and we're going to call them like hex 16 and hex 1, just so we know which digit it's going to be. Now, before I do anything else, I'll show you something. If you go in here, and if you're on Windows, do Control, comma, and if you're on Mac, do Command, comma. I'm on a Mac, I'm going to do Command, comma, and I'm going to try out dark mode for this and just see how it looks. I'm going to use Tomorrow Night Bright down here. So I went over here, and they have theme, just so you know where I went. It says Chrome right now. I'm going to go down to Tomorrow Night Bright, because that should be nice and contrasty for what we're doing, I think. And it is fairly bright, so we'll try that out, see if you like looking at that when you're watching the video. And you'll probably like working in that a little bit better. I don't know if, for the video if that helps. We'll see. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to make two variables, one for hex 16, and basically that's going to be RGB divided by 16, except if you did this, it's going to come up with a decimal. We don't want a decimal. And if you remember, we use something called floor division. Do you remember what we use? We use 2 slashes. That's floor division. So that will only determine 16 going in there once without any remainders. So this is with no remainders. That's floor division. We talked about that early on. And then we're also going to use one called hex 1, because these will be our ones place. And for here, we'll do RGB, and we'll do the modulus, which is the percent sign. And that's also going to be 16, because that's going to be taking 16, dividing by it, and getting the remainder. So this one's getting remainder, and I'll just put that just as a reminder for us. This is the remainder. 16's no remainder. So those are the numbers we want. So that works pretty good. I'll put a comma here. So that's what we want. And then all we're going to do is print it out, really. So I'm just going to go here and do a print statement. Now, one thing I'll do is I'll do one extra little thing here. I'll just make a variable, and I'll call it hex. And just to note that you can do this. Now, it's coming up blue. I don't know if that's reserved or not. Maybe I'll just put hex _ num, just so it doesn't show up in blue. I didn't have a problem doing that before, but I'll put hex num here, and I'll make a variable. And then what I'll do is you can still do an f string here, so you don't have to put everything in your print statement. You can go here and just say, okay, f, and put quotes, and I'll put 2 quotes, and I'll just put my 2 variables. And I like using the f string, that's why I'm using this. You could use just commas in there, but that way we can throw in a pound sign in there to be right before the hex. So I'm just going to put in hex 16, because that's going to be first. And you don't have to put a comma or anything. You just want them right next to each other. You don't even want a space. So I'm going to put another set of curly braces, and I'm going to put hex 1. And right before here, inside the string, inside the quote, I'm just going to put a pound sign. So that won't work as a comment or anything because it's inside a string. It'll work like a pound sign. So what's going to happen here is nothing's going to happen here. If I save this right now and I run it, why is nothing going to happen here? Let's try it out. Enter RGB. Let's see, I'll do 255. Nothing happens. We don't have a print statement. We made a variable that represents an f string. And this way, all we have to do now is just say print and just print out the hex number. And this is helpful if you ever have some kind of long string or anything and you don't want to have to put it all inside a print statement. That way you can just print out the variable. So we're just making a variable that represents what's going to be printed out. So this is the statement that's going to be printed out, and this is it being printed out. So we're just printing out hex number. Now, when I save it and I run it, I could put in 255, and it says 1515. Now that's perfect. That's what we want, except we want 15 converted to an F and 15 converted to an F. So we're going to have to do an if-else statement for both the hex 16s and the hex 1s, so that they transfer, so that if it's over 10, it'll print out the right letter instead of using the number. Now it's working right now because that's correct. And if you run it and you put in something like, just 10 or something, that's saying 0 and 10. It's saying 0 16s and 10 1s. Now that we shouldn't be able to use a 10 for 1s as well. But everything's working, so we're just going to do our if-else statements. And I think what I'll do is I'll take a break here. And for part 2, we'll just do the if-else statements so the video doesn't run too long.